UN condemnation and the offer of support from the United States has done little to quell the violence. What do you think happens next?
Well, we've got to say to both sides, Laura, that this will end as previous conflicts over Gaza have ended, that is with a ceasefire. Neither side has a path to victory here. It will end in a mutual agreement to cease striking at the other. The sooner that happens, the less chance of the less chance of youngsters being killed in rubble, which is the shocking visual image that assaults our senses as we follow once again the exchange of fire between Gaza and Israel. This must end in a ceasefire, as all previous conflicts between Gaza and Israel, between Hamas in Gaza and the IDF have ended.
Look, it's terribly lopsided when you look at the death toll, and that is hard to avoid. Israel says it will stop firing rockets once Hamas do from Gaza. Is it that simple?
Well, this gives us the ceasefire, but what is far from simple is the sort of commitment from Israel that is essential towards a peace between these two peoples living side by side, and the ultimate that we all want, which is peace based on a two-state solution. So if we're peeling back to the cause of the riots that we've seen in cities in Israel with a mixed Arab-Jewish population, or the tension in Jerusalem, we come to one very simple piece of Israeli behaviour, and that is the remorseless spread of settlements on occupied Palestinian land. In the land that every agreement since the Oslo Peace Accords in the early 1990s has designated as a future Palestinian state, you've got a spread of Israeli settlements. And this is smothering the prospect of the two-state solution that we all say we want. More specifically, you've seen forced evacuations in East Jerusalem, a horrific and inhumane policy that has seen Palestinians forced out of apartments to make way for Jewish settlers in what's got to be considered an attack on the Arab characteristics of East Jerusalem. And that's got to cease. The settlement activity has got to cease. Otherwise, the prospect of a Palestinian state, a two-state solution, is smothered under this tidal wave of Israeli settlements.
Indeed, and that has always been a sticking point, at least for the last 2 decades, when it comes to a two-state solution, any kind of peace in that part of the world. But we've got to look at the geography and the reality of the space in both of these, in the Palestinian occupied land, in Israel and the Gaza Strip itself. I mean, Israel will argue, Bob Carr, that with its growing population, it needs more space. The Palestinians arguing, Gaza and those settlements to the north, that it needs more space, and it's being really smothered by the build-up of their buildings. I mean, Gaza is only, I think, 36 square kilometres. So it's difficult for any of those groups within that part to prosper.
Yes, but there is a road to peace. And the road to peace begins with Israel saying it accepts the two-state solution, and that means accepting the reality of a Palestinian state with all the necessary security guarantees for Israel. You've got the Palestinian leadership, for all its faults, not Hamas, but the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, saying it would agree to a state, that is a Palestinian state, without armed forces. Now that is an offer that any Israeli government thinking of the long-term future would be well advised to accept. What other people in the world is saying, we will accept a state on that basis. We won't have armed forces. Now that gives Israel the security guarantees it's got, backed by the strength we all know Israel has got to cross a border into a Palestinian state, were Hamas to move in and threaten Israel based on 1967 boundaries, with agreed negotiated adjustments. Now, this cannot happen. You cannot have progress to a two-state solution while the state, the land that is going to be the basis for the Palestinian state, is subject to the remorseless spread of Israeli settlements. Only in the last year, Netanyahu has approved an additional 12,000 settlers. When I went to Ramallah as Australian Foreign Minister, to the largest city on the West Bank, an Arab city, a Palestinian city, you looked up at the hillside and it was occupied by massive Israeli settlement blocks. They send a message to Palestinians that we, the Israelis, are not agreeing under our chauvinistic government. We're not agreeing to a separate Palestinian state. And in that despair, you've got a constituency that will listen, at least some of the time, to the poisonous terrorist message coming from Hamas.
Well, we've seen these Hamas rockets from Gaza now reaching settlements, cities, I should say, and areas in Israel like Beersheba. Israel argues that it is just protecting its own citizens with these rockets being launched into Gaza. Do you accept that?
Yes, I do. And as Foreign Minister, I said that. I said that Israel's got a right to defend itself, and the sending of rockets from Gaza into territory, and into territory where the chances of civilian deaths is very high, has got to be condemned. And I've said that talking to audiences of Palestinian sympathisers. Israel will respond, and the Israeli response, I criticise Israel for this, will not be discriminating, and it will not be proportionate. You've got an agreement that war crimes are being committed by both sides. Hence what I said at the beginning of our interview. The starting point has got to be a conclusion to these hostilities the way every previous conflict involving Gaza and Israel has been ended, and that is in an agreed ceasefire, the end of firing on the other. I think there's got to be creative diplomacy, Laura, I think involving Jordan in negotiations with Israel to see an end to provocative Israeli behaviour driven by settlers in Jerusalem is vital. America's not in a position to exert leadership. An American brokered peace has been a 20 or 30 year history of failure. Creative diplomacy is required, and involving Jordan and Egypt in finding a way out for both sides is going to be part of that.
Well, we hope we see that creative diplomacy and ceasefire sooner rather than later. Bob Carr, thank you for your time.